Great, well thanks very much everyone for coming. It's great to see so many people here. As James said, I've been part of Humanists UK for quite a few years now, and I've been along to quite a few talks, so it's nice to give a little something back. As you can see, I'm going to be talking about us today, about where we come from, about when we think we evolved, and how we think that happened. And I say think because fundamentally we don't really know still, and it's an ongoing area of research that is fascinating to me. Okay. All right, so I wanted to start off firstly by talking about a bit of background, a bit of history on the question, like how did we work out that we were from somewhere in the first place? And so, as I'm sure we can all imagine here, understanding of human origins, at least in the European intellectual tradition, has been very much paralysed by a Judeo-Christian view of the world. That sort of slowly started to change around about the late sort of 1700s and early 1800s, when there was increasing evidence of sort of deep time, so things like evidence of ice ages and long lost creatures that no longer existed today, i.e. dinosaurs. But even then, no one really seriously considered the idea of ancient humans. That was until this thing was discovered in a quarry in Germany by quarrymen, and they handed over these bones to these two men, Fulrott and Schaffhausen. These are two German anthropologists, and they took a look at the bones, and they noticed a few oddities about them. First of all, I don't know how well you guys can see on this screen, but they noticed that there were particularly this skull had really prominent, like heavy brow ridges. So it also had quite an elongated skull, which was pretty odd, and also these very bowed legs. And fortunately, they were open-minded enough to the idea of ancient humans, and so they ended up publishing this skeleton and suggesting that this might be a new species of human. As you can imagine, in the 1850s, there was immense backlash by the scientific and religious communities. But long story short, eventually several intellectuals were convinced that this was a new species of human, and so decided to give it a name. And they decided to name it after the valley in which the Feldhofer Cave was found. Feldhofer Cave was in the Neander Valley of Western Germany. In German, translates to Neanderthal. So this is the first ever Neanderthal skeleton found in 1856. And it was really here that the discipline of paleoanthropology was kicked off. And people started to seriously think about where we might actually come from. But it was, of course, Darwin himself who was the first to seriously propose that we might be from Africa. He said in The Descent of Man in 1871, "It is probable that Africa was formerly inhabited by extinct apes closely allied, meaning related, to the gorilla and chimpanzee. And as these two species are man's nearest allies, it is somewhat more probable that our early progenitors also lived on the African continent." Despite that though, no one really listened to Darwin for quite a few decades, until, but kind of for two reasons. Firstly, a lack of evidence at the time, and secondly, also racism. Like, how on earth could humanity possibly come from Africa? It took until the sort of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s for new evidence to sort of emerge from Africa, and people started to sort of take a note. Maybe Darwin was actually right. And by the latter half of the 20th century, we had come up with a sort of family tree that looks something like this, and you might have seen something like this before. So this goes from down 654 million years ago up to the present day. We have certain species like Australopithecus you might have heard of. It's like the fossil known as Lucy that some of you might have heard of. Yeah, I've seen lots of nodding heads. Yeah. Yes. So many people have heard of Lucy. We've also often heard of things like the Rift Valley in Africa and Ethiopia and Kenya, and that's where humanity is from. And yes, to an extent, that is all true, more or less. But the key thing to note is that concept, what you might be thinking of there, refers to this area of the family tree here. And this is a reconstruction of Lucy, what she might have looked like here. So it refers to the evolution of our genus. So we are Homo sapiens, Homo is our genus, and sapiens is our species. That idea that we evolved in East Africa, in the Rift Valley and all that refers to the evolution of our genus between about 3 million years ago and about 2 million years ago. And so under this traditional model, Australopithecus evolved somehow into early members of our genus Homo, who then somehow evolved into early members of Homo erectus, which means upright man, and Homo erectus ended up spreading around the rest of Africa and then out into Eurasia. And then under this traditional model, Homo erectus would then evolve somehow again into Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. But the key thing I want to highlight again here is that the traditional thinking of the Rift Valley in Africa, that refers to our genus. So the question is, where on earth did our species come from? Because just because we evolved, our genus evolved in East Africa, there's no reason why our species also had to evolve there. These are completely separate questions, and they're separated by about 2 million years. So where do our species come from? And I think this is much less well understood by many people. And it was still not very well understood even as late as the 1970s, when there were two main competing theories, two main competing models for how Homo sapiens might have emerged. So there were those, the Africanists as they were sometimes called, who thought that Darwin was right in that Homo erectus evolved in Africa, and then one small population somewhere in Africa, maybe East Africa, evolved into Homo sapiens somehow, and then they were so successful that they spread out and replaced everyone else in Africa, and then spread out into Eurasia and replaced everyone else there as well. That was the recent African origin model. The other model, the bitter rivals of the Africanists, were those who believed in the multi-regional evolution idea. And that was basically the idea that Homo erectus had spread out across all of Afro-Eurasia, and then had collectively, simultaneously evolved into Homo sapiens through interbreeding across all of these continents, simultaneously. And this was a serious idea at the time. Both of them were very serious ideas. And the needle only started to swing, really, in the 1980s with something that the so-called human revolution, as it's sometimes called. And of course, the thing that caused this human revolution was DNA. DNA first started to be applied to this question of where we come from in the 80s, particularly these two papers by Wainscoat and by Rebecca Cann here. And these papers took DNA from modern people from, I think, about 5 different continents, and assessed the relatedness between them. And one of the main things they found was that people from Europe, many indigenous peoples from Asia, Native Americans, Polynesians, were all surprisingly closely related to each other. Whereas indigenous groups in Africa were really distantly related to each other. Surprisingly distantly related. And the only way they could explain this was if humans had evolved in Africa over thousands of, tens of thousands of years, which gave that enough time for different African groups to separate from each other. And then one group left Africa and ended up becoming all of the different ethnic groups from the rest of the world that we know. That was the thinking in the 1980s, and it very much swung the needle in the direction of the recent African origin idea. Such that this very influential paper in 1988 came out, in which Chris Stringer and Peter Andrews concluded that only the genetic diversity of sub-Saharan African populations reflect an age appropriate for our species origin. But, they said, plausible precursor populations are sampled in sites in northern, eastern and southern Africa. So the exact time, place and mode of origin of our species cannot yet be determined at the time. And this paper really is when people woke up and thought, okay, we actually do come from Africa, and the multi-regional idea, we can put that to bed. But just as a side note, Chris Stringer is a lovely guy. He's still around at the Natural History Museum in London. He does a lot of talks and podcasts and interviews and all that sort of thing. So I'd recommend looking him up and going along to something if you're interested in this. He's also very active on Twitter/X now, and such that a lot of the developments in paleoanthropology in this subject that I find out about through his Twitter feed. So I'd recommend following him. He's a nice guy. But yeah, so the exact time, place and mode of origin of the species cannot yet be determined. So that sets us up well to have a look at some of the evidence then that we have. And while we go through it, have a think about these questions. First of all, where within Africa did we emerge? Was there a single origin somewhere in northern or southern or east Africa, or did we emerge in multiple regions simultaneously? Also, when did this happen? Was it a gradual process, or did we sort of appear suddenly? And then how did this happen? Was there sort of one group that adapted locally and then spread, or were there widespread changes across multiple populations? Okay, so let's have a look at some of the evidence for where our physicality comes from, our physical morphology. And before we do that, we need to have a quick think about what kind of characteristics that we're looking for in Homo sapiens. So when we look at some skulls, do they look like Homo sapiens or do they not? What kind of characteristics are we looking for? Well, these two skulls here, that's a Neanderthal on the left. This, I'm sure you can recognize, is one of us. Neanderthals are not our early ancestors, but they have a lot of sort of morphological characteristics in them that's quite illustrative for our point here. And we're very similar to early humans. So, for example, one thing you might be able to immediately notice is that Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens tended to have very elongated skulls, whereas we tend to have these what's called globular skulls, like a globe, very oddly rounded heads. And that is weird, by the way. All other hominins don't have round heads. We're the weird ones here. Many hominins, including Neanderthals and early sapiens, tend to have these very prominent brow ridges, and I pointed this out in the Feldhofer skeleton, the very first Neanderthal that was found in 1856. Whereas we tend to have very reduced brow ridges, and you can do this now if you want. Feel just above your eye sockets, just there. You feel that little ridge, sort of bump there. That is the remnants of our early human ancestors. Our ancestors tended to also have very what's called a prognathous face, which means a face that sticks out quite a lot. It's not too easy to see here, basically because the Neanderthal skull is sort of twisted a bit, but if you orient it a little bit left in your mind, then you can see you go down from the eye socket, it sticks out quite a bit. Whereas we have very flat faces that go straight down from our foreheads. And again, that is very weird. We shouldn't have that. And that's probably one of the reasons why we have so many sinus problems as a species, is because our faces are so squashed and there's not enough space in our sinuses anymore. So yeah, we are very weird as hominins go. Our ancestors also had very reduced chins, almost no chins at all, whereas we have the sort of the bumpy, pointy out chin, and you can feel that as well, a bit of a bump there. And that is also an oddity that's unique to Homo sapiens. So have a look out for these things as we go through some of the skulls. All right. So the way in which we can do this is have a look at things called grades in the transitional fossils. So as we've established, we seem to have come somehow from Homo erectus in Africa, and then they eventually somehow evolved into Homo sapiens. And this grade system is quite useful, illustrative way of thinking about that transition. So grade 1 transitional fossils would be those that are particularly archaic features, so with the heavy brow ridges and all of that thing, but with hints of Homo sapiens. And then there'll be grade 2 and grade 3, with grade 3 being looking very much like Homo sapiens. Worth noting that this grade system is not scientific in any way, it's just a useful illustrative way that some people have suggested that we can view our evolution. So these are two of the main skulls that are argued to be part of grade 1. There's the Bodo 1 cranium from Ethiopia. That's about 640,000 years old, and Ka, by the way, means killer annum. That's Latin for 1,000 years, and it's just the unit that archaeologists use for these things. Then the Broken Hill or Kabwe cranium from Zambia, which is quite a bit later as well. But we'll get on to that being quite a lot later in a minute. But you will notice that there are quite a few archaic features about this, like the Kabwe fossil has very prominent brow ridges, the Bodo cranium has quite a prognathous face to it. Oh, and by the way, cranium means a skull without the jaw. So if it has a jaw, it's a skull. If it doesn't have a jaw, it's a cranium. That's just how it works. But there's the archaic features, but also they have hints of sapiens. So the Bodo cranium has quite reduced brow ridges, and Kabwe has very flat face to it. So there's little hints even as far back as this time of Homo sapiens emerging. So then we can move on to the grade 2 transitional fossils. These are ones that have accentuated features close to Homo sapiens, such that some scientists think they are actually sapiens. And there's quite a few of these scattered around Africa, but the ones I really want to draw your attention to are the fossils from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. This was a massive deal when this was found in 2015 and then published in 2017. But basically because they are thought to be the earliest Homo sapiens that we've ever found by some authors. And I think I would roughly agree with that. Sometimes they're considered to be basal Homo sapiens, as we call it, so we're at the base of the lineage that eventually became us. And the reason they think this is because the face looks just so human. So it's a little bit difficult to see from the skull, but we'll see a reconstruction in a moment. Very flat face, almost no brow ridge at all. Still with quite an elongated cranium, but that's why they're part of grade 2. But the reason why this was so massive was because of their age. So a few of you on the CLH WhatsApp group might have done a poll that I think James put up a few days ago, which was, I think it was something like, to the best of your knowledge, when do you think Homo sapiens first evolved? And many of you put the answer of 200,000 years ago, which is you would be right, pre-2015. And that is certainly what we used to think. We emerged 200,000 years ago. But then this fossil came out, and this particular paper, which found that the Jebel Irhoud fossils were 315,000 years old, which is pretty massive. That pushes back the antiquity of us by more than 100,000 years. So yeah, what do we make of that? And then I said we'd see a reconstruction. This is what these guys, the Kennis brothers, think the Jebel Irhoud man might have looked like. So these are experts into reconstructing faces from skulls, and they do this for a lot of skulls that were found in human evolution. I'd say I don't know about you, but he looks pretty human to me. Like, it looks like the kind of slightly wacky guy you might meet on the bus, you know. I mean, the only things to note are that the hair and skin colour and the general get-up are entirely speculative. But if you just focus on the facial features themselves, he looks very human to me. So that's why we think he's probably one of the earliest Homo sapiens. And then we move on to grade 3 transitional fossils, and these are the ones that are considered to be fully Homo sapiens by most authors. So the main ones that are cited are Homo Kabish from Ethiopia and Herto 1 also from Ethiopia. And again, there's a bit of a theme here. We used to think that they were 190,000 years old and 160,000, but then a paper came out just a couple of years ago in 2022, which reanalyzed the age of Homo Kabish using modern methods, and they found that it was not 190,000 years old, but 233,000 years old. So that pushed fully modern Homo sapiens back by another 40,000 years. So, and this is probably going to keep happening over the coming years. We're going to keep pushing back the antiquity of our species. Okay, so just to sum up quickly what we've been looking at here. So this is a graph of multiple different fossils that are found across Africa over time there, and in different regions: North Africa, Central, East Africa, and Southern Africa. And we've got different types of anatomy. So archaic anatomy is the sort of grade 1, the really early fossils, and then partial or uncertain anatomy is grade 2, and then modern is grade 3. And you can see the Broken Hill, that's the Kabwe fossil from grade 1, is down there in East Africa, or East/Southern Africa. And then Jebel Arud up in North Africa is one of the grade 2s, and then Homo Kabish is here. And so the key things to note here are that Homo sapiens, the early sort of characteristics, seem to have emerged somewhere between 300 and 200,000 years ago. And secondly, that they seem to have emerged across all of these different regions without any clear sort of rhyme or reason to them. So potentially simultaneously. And that's what the sort of current thinking is that's led to some authors, particularly Ellie Sherry, who used to be at Oxford, now is at the Max Planck Institute in Germany. She has really championed this idea of that Homo sapiens didn't evolve in one place in Africa at one time, but we evolved across the continent simultaneously through interbreeding. She calls this the Pan-African model, the Pan-African hypothesis. And this was a very influential paper in 2019 that she published, in which she says the past half century has seen a move from a multi-regionalist view of human origins to widespread acceptance that modern humans emerged in Africa. That was the 1970s debate that we had a look at. But we argue that a simple out-of-Africa model, the recent African origin model that was decided on in the 80s, is also outdated, and that the current state of the evidence favours a structured Pan-African meta-population model of human origins. What does that mean? So to try and explain this, let's have a look at this graphic here. Let's first of all focus on this image of Africa down here. So potentially around 350 to 250,000 years ago, according to this Pan-African idea, there may have been multiple groups spread out across all of Africa. Some of them had particularly archaic or ancestral traits, that's the green there, and some of them had certain more derived traits, that's the scientific term for modern morphology. But they were crucially all interconnected genetically, meaning that they were interbreeding together. And so collectively they formed a meta-population. They weren't isolated populations, they were all interconnected. And then according to the Pan-African model, they interbred so much that over time, eventually maybe around about 200,000 years ago, by the time that Homo Kabish, one of the grade 3 fossils, was around, that these derived traits of Homo sapiens had emerged across all of Africa and were interbreeding and intermingling all at the same time. That's the Pan-African model. There is also this other model that was proposed by Meneganzin and her colleagues just a couple of years ago, which I quite like, which is the idea that maybe, yes, the Pan-African model is correct and there was all this metapopulation interbreeding, but certain traits, like for example this globular cranium that we have, might have emerged in one particular place in Africa, for example East Africa, and then spread out through, we call expansion pulses, basically migrations out across Africa, and were picked up by other groups through interbreeding. And I think that's sort of trying to find a middle ground between the staunchly Pan-African model and the single origin, we only evolved in one place kind of model. I think the middle ground works quite well. And so, okay. Right, so that was a lot. Let's quickly summarize what we've learned about where our bodies and our physical morphology comes from. So firstly, we did not evolve suddenly, but we emerged gradually between at least 15,000 years ago, which was Jebel Arud, to 200,000 years ago, around about the time of Homo Kubish and Hurto. In this time, many groups seem to have existed across Africa, each with an eclectic mixture of Homo sapiens traits to them, but all genetically interconnected. So that's a metapopulation is the phrase that we're using now. But it was through interbreeding, many traits were exchanged and eventually coalesced into Homo sapiens morphology, the kind that we're familiar with today. That's the Pan-African idea. So that's what we think about with our bodies. What about our minds? I think that we can all agree to some extent that it's not just our bodies, our physicality that makes us human. To some extent, and we can debate the philosophy behind the details, but to some extent it's also our minds and our cultures that make us different in some way from other organisms. And so at what point did those emerge? And so this is where we talk about the controversial question of something called behavioural modernity. This is a massive topic that's incredibly controversial, but basically it's the idea of at what point in our evolution did we start to do things that were not purely for our survival, but were also for the sake of aesthetic purposes or for cultural reasons. Things that, when did we start making jewellery, for instance? When did we start making artwork? When did we start using colours? These sorts of things. And these are all lumped together in this concept of behavioural modernity, and it's sort of used as a proxy for when did our minds and our cultures first emerge. So many of you may have heard something along these lines before, something called the cognitive revolution. Has anyone ever heard of that phrase before? Seeing some nodding. It's cognitive revolution down there. Look at that lovely straight curve. Isn't history nice and simple and easy like that? And a lot of it seems to have been popularized by this book, Sapiens, which some of you may have read. It's a very interesting book in some ways. I think some of us in Humanists UK are not fans of this book, but that's a story for another time. But basically, the cognitive revolution idea, which Sapiens popularizes, is that we suddenly had some sort of flourishing of our minds around about either 70,000 years ago, some have also claimed 40,000 years ago, in which everything suddenly came into being. We started doing artwork, we started making complex tools, etc., etc., etc. The reality is very different. This is a myth. Forget about the cognitive revolution. This never happened. And frankly, I think it's kind of irresponsible that this book really pushed that idea, because this was published in 2011, and we've known at least since the year 2000 that this was a myth. We know that particularly from this paper, McBrearty and Brooks 2000, the revolution that wasn't a new interpretation of the origin of modern human behaviour. This was a very influential paper. Again, lots of influential papers here. But this, it's so influential that that revolution that wasn't that phrase has been sort of parodied many times by other papers, like the revolution that still isn't, the revolution that might be, and all these things. But the point that they were making is that they looked at the African evidence. So previously, the cognitive revolution idea came mainly from looking at the European evidence. And we look at the African evidence, and things are much more complicated. And certainly, all of these different types of technologies and modern behaviours, whatever that means, that we seem to have collectively agreed are signatures of our minds and cultures, go back a lot earlier than, say, 70,000 or 40,000. For example, pigment processing, which is another way to say red ochre, the use of red ochre for like colouring stone tools and shells and bodies and walls and all that sort of thing. That goes back to, they thought, at least 280,000 years ago in 2000. We now know it probably goes back even further. Same goes for new lithic types. Lithic is the scientific term for stone tools. So blades and points, these are new and complex types of tools that they started creating around about this time. Also artwork or engravings, that's what notational pieces, brackets incised, means there. So this thing here is considered by some people to be the earliest piece of artwork in human history that we know of. It's a tiny little rock from Blombos Cave in South Africa, 100,000 years old, and it has these sort of cross-hatched pattern to them. So leave you to decide whether or not you think that's artwork or not. That's a debate that some people have, but still, it's undoubtedly something. And then another thing that is often pointed as an example of modern behaviour is jewellery, which this is very common throughout Africa and to some extent the rest of Eurasia as well at this time, are things called shell beads, and they're noted right at the top there, which are shells just fished out of a river or from the sea, in which these early peoples have carved a tiny hole into the shell and then strung a piece of twine through them and worn them as a necklace. This is very common throughout Africa. And the earliest that we know of now is 142,000 years old, so much earlier than I think the 60,000 that we thought in the year 2000. But one thing I want to highlight is that this makes it look like it's a nice linear progression, like we develop these things, then we develop these things, and then we sort of suddenly had all of this whole package of modern human behaviour. The reality is much messier. So this is quite a confusing graphic, don't worry. Talk you through it. This is, of course, Africa lying on its side here. Each of the black dots there is an archaeological site where we found some evidence of modern or symbolic or complex behaviour. Of things like, up in the top left-hand corner there, you can see red ochre is the colour red here. Shell beads are in blue. And engravings in black, and these are basically denoting when we find these types of behaviours at different time periods in these regions. The key thing to notice here are that in each of these regions there isn't a very clear emergence of a particular behaviour appears and then is carried on throughout the rest of history. Many things, like if we just focus on red ochre appears in southern Africa, is used for several thousand years, and then disappears and is not used again for another 30,000 years or something. Even though it's a bit difficult to see on the screen, but people were here, that's another block there. People were still there. Same goes for like red ochre in East Africa and in North Africa there as well, and for a bunch of other different behaviours. So the point is that groups seem to have taken on or developed certain types of modern behaviours and then lost them at certain times and then reacquired them and then moved around, and some may have thought that they were no longer culturally relevant to them and then reacquired them many thousands of years later. Basically it's very messy is the point that this paper, which was updating the McBrearty and Brooks paper, And I think they actually called themselves the revolution that still isn't, and and that was their update to that paper. Okay, that was a lot again, so let's do a quick summary of that. So, there was no sudden cognitive revolution at any time. Instead, this complex or symbolic behaviour emerged sort of gradually from at least 300,000 years ago in a sort of messy and mosaic fashion. That's the term often used in these papers, mosaic fashion all across Africa. But some areas gained and lost and reacquired different technologies or behaviours at different times, and we're still trying to figure out exactly where and when and what was going on there. Okay, so that is the main body of everything. I thought now then we would take a look at some interesting new directions, some exciting new developments in the field that I think are going to shape the discipline in the coming years. So one of the first ones is, what about West and Central Africa? If we look back at this confusing graph, notice that the vast majority of the evidence that we have for early Homo sapiens comes from East Africa, especially in Southern Africa, and the northern tip of Africa there, which leaves a huge gap throughout all of West and Central Africa where we know very little about who was there, when they were there, and what they were doing. And that's something that Ellie Sherry and her colleague James Blinkhorn are trying to change with their project. It's called the AWARE project, which I think stands for West Africa's Role in Recent Human Evolution. I don't know if that acronym works, but never mind. They're doing some really interesting work where I believe they've been working in a bunch of West African countries like Senegal and Burkina Faso and Ivory Coast and Nigeria and a couple of other places where they're trying to find cave sites or early human sites in these regions where we can try to learn what the contribution of these regions were to our evolution, because we know people were there and they must have contributed something to our evolution, especially if the Pan-African idea is true. Secondly, there have been some really fascinating advances in genetics in the last few years, so especially led by Matthias Meyer of the Max Planck Institute in Germany. They've come up with a couple of really interesting new methods for, firstly, the one on the left, identifying DNA fragments from microlayers of cave soil. What that means is that they've been taking tiny fractions of sediment from caves, and they can extract tiny fragments of DNA from these sections and identify what kind of organism, what kind of species they might have come from. So you can see in this example on the left here, there's a slice of cave sediment, and then they've managed to break it up into a bunch of different sections, and again a little bit difficult to see, but in a couple of these sections, in section 5 and 16 here, they've identified hominid DNA. So that is human DNA. So they found that humans were here in this cave, I think in Siberia, where they trialed this, without us actually finding any physical remains of humans there. That could be massive if this works at a broader scale. It's only just come out in 2022, they're still working on new developments. But potentially that would allow us to track the movements of human groups long distance, say for example out of Africa, without needing any physical evidence of them. We could just trace fragments of their DNA. And then the second major development they came up with is this one, which they managed to extract the DNA from the surface of an artifact. So this is a pendant that was made out of a deer tooth, and they basically identified human DNA sitting on the pendant itself was predominantly of a young woman who lived about 20,000 years ago, who was also related to some indigenous Siberian groups today. So that is, if this works, I mean, I think we need really good preservation, but if it works large scale, that is massive. We could potentially find exactly who was using and working and wearing these kind of objects. So what, sorry?
How could they tell she was young? Surely her DNA would have been the same
It was suggested based on the level of mutations in it, but we don't know exactly. Yeah, you're right, it's difficult to say. So those are some really interesting advances in genetics that would be great to see where they go in future. Next, there's also some oddities still in Africa. So these are late survivors and new species that we are discovering. So you may remember the Broken Hill crabway cranium. That was from grade 1, I believe. Very archaic looking skull, but it is just here, at Broken Hill, about 299,000 years ago. That is 16,000 years after Jebel Arud, what we think is the earliest Homo sapiens that we've found. Which means that there were apparently these incredibly archaic looking hominins wandering around at the same time that early Homo sapiens were wandering around. So this was always an odd question for quite a while, and it's only been enhanced by this new discovery in 2013 by this guy Lee Berger at the University of Wits in Johannesburg. He announced the discovery of this guy, Homo naledi, this new species that was found in a cave in South Africa and was dated to between 330-ish thousand years ago to 230,000 years ago. So that's exactly the time period in which we seem to have been evolving. There was this guy and others like him still wandering around. So who were these archaic hominins? How did they survive so late? How did they interact with us? Did we, for example, interbreed with them? Certainly a possibility. And how did they influence our evolution? That's going to be really interesting to see going forwards. And speaking of interbreeding, you might have heard of a pretty major development that came out about sort of 10-15 years ago about admixture or interbreeding with other species like Neanderthals. So this is the sort of classic out of Africa model. Don't have time to go into here, but if you're interested, ask me later. So at some point, probably before 120,000 years ago, we emerged out of Africa and encountered the natives. So and in Western Asia and Europe, that was Neanderthals, a bit like this woman here, called Shanidar Cave from northern Iraq. This is something that my supervisor has been working on. She discovered her a few years ago. And we know that we interbred with Neanderthals because everyone in this room here has between 1 and 3% Neanderthal DNA. Potentially some slightly more, some slightly less. Those of Sub-Saharan African background have much less, but still have a tiny amount, just because of mixing with European populations over the thousands of years, Romans and Arabs and European colonialists. But we know that we interbred with them, and this was a massive development when this came out. It sort of entirely changed our understanding of who we are and where we come from. But we know it was probably quite common, this interbreeding, because this one jawbone that was found in Romania, he's a Homo sapiens, but his great-great-great-grandfather or mother was a Neanderthal, so only about 100 to 150 years earlier. And then there's also, some people might have spotted in the northeast, this yellowish area, something that also came out in 2010, discovery of a brand new species. These are called the Denisovans, after Denisova Cave in Siberia, where they were first identified. And they were actually only found because of this tiny little sort of finger bone that was found in this cave, and it was thought to be, oh, it's probably a Neanderthal. We found Neanderthals in Denisova Cave before. Let's just run it through the DNA machine, and it came out as, wow, this doesn't look like any hominin we've ever found before. It turned out to be a new species, which we're now roughly calling Homo denisova, although that hasn't been officially confirmed yet. But we think that Denisovans lived basically throughout all of East Asia, and they probably looked maybe something like this. We think that they had quite sort of wide faces, wider faces than we do, and quite long fingers, but that's sort of all we know about them so far because we haven't actually found a full skeleton. But we also know that we interbred with them because peoples, particularly Tibetan indigenous peoples, indigenous Australians, many Polynesians and Native Americans all have a few percentage points of Denisovan DNA in them. So the big question here is, how did that affect and influence our evolution and where we come from? And that is going to be a really fascinating topic over the next few years. For example, there's keeps being new papers coming out every year about the ways in which Neanderthal and Denisovan genetics might have influenced us even today. So, and these are, this is early days, but some of these seem genuine and potentially legitimate. So one of them, some of them can be quite whimsical. For example, it was found that the genes that denote our body clock, we seem to have kept the Neanderthal version of that gene. And so it seems like Neanderthals are waking us up in the morning every day. But then some are a bit less whimsical and a bit more interesting. For example, it was found about 10 years ago actually, now, wow, that native indigenous Tibetans may have adapted to high altitude using Denisovan DNA, or Denisovan DNA helps Tibetans to adapt to high altitude. And another very popular one that's often talked about, Neanderthals may have boosted our immune system, particularly helped us to resist certain pathogens, certain diseases in Eurasia. And that makes a lot of sense if you think about, as we migrated out of Africa, we're going to be encountering all these new diseases. And just based on pure natural selection, those that had this Neanderthal resistance from the indigenous population might have done a bit better. And so there's all things like lupus and even like type 2 diabetes and a whole bunch of viral infections that are thought that Neanderthal DNA is helping us to resist. Even some people have gone so far as to suggest that even Denisovan genes and potentially Neanderthal genes as well could have conferred enhanced immunity against a particular variation of SARS-CoV-19. And this is based on some findings of certain indigenous groups, particularly in Polynesia and the Philippines, had surprisingly good resistance to COVID-19. And one suggestion is that that came from the Denisovans, and similar claims have been made about the Neanderthals as well. So the next time someone makes a silly joke about Neanderthals being primitive, and oh, that person looks like he has a lot of Neanderthal DNA in them, well, probably a good thing, because they're helping us every day today. So, just a quick summary of everything that we've been through. So, Homo sapiens emerged gradually in a mosaic fashion across all of Africa through interbreeding between different groups. The earliest signs appear around 315,000 years ago, and the first clear Homo sapiens appear by 200,000 years ago at least. And then complex or symbolic behavior also emerged in this sort of messy mosaic fashion over tens of thousands of years. And interbreeding with Neanderthals and Denisovans has contributed to many useful genes that still help us to this day. But many questions still remain. There you go, thank you very much. So this, I mentioned that I've been working at a cave in northern Iraq that's called Shanidar Cave. I think James mentioned that at the start. This is the project that I'm going to be working on for my PhD starting in September, October. If you are interested in learning more about Neanderthals, though, my team recently had a Netflix documentary made all about them and about the site, and my supervisor, Emma, here is interviewed multiple times about this Neanderthal woman that she found there a few years ago. So if you're interested, go and watch the documentary. And lastly, I think we're going to be doing a discussion after this, after a break. Yeah. One thing to leave you with, as you have a break, what does all of this that we've been talking about mean for how we think about ourselves, who we are, and where we come from? And is any of this applicable to sort of better understanding the challenges that we have today? So, with that in mind, let's have a break. So it's sort of all of those. So there's a couple of reasons. Firstly, probably the main reason is just a lack of scientific interest and research in that region. So there's been, because of a bunch of finds in the 20s, 30s and 40s, in East Africa and the Rift Valley and all that, everyone sort of converged on East Africa as the place to find early humans. And then a bunch of, there's a lot of very well preserved caves on the coast of South Africa as well, so everyone converged on those as well. And so in the end, all of our understanding of early humans just comes from those two areas, and now recently in North Africa as well. There's been much less interest and research put into West Africa and Central Africa. So it's partly a scientific bias there. The other reason is just a result of preservation difficulties. A lot of West Africa and Central Africa is covered in rainforest, as you say, and rainforest is terrible for preserving archaeological remains. They degrade and disappear very quickly. Whereas East Africa is a lot drier, South Africa has a lot of caves that can be very dry, North Africa is the same as well. There's probably a lot of sites in what is now the Sahara as well, but again, lack of research into that area. We need to do more research in the area and get lucky that maybe there's a cave or two around there that preserved well. But it's a difficult one.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Oscar.
Right.
Very early on in your talk, you said that Homo sapiens, the evolution of their skull shape was very odd and different to sort of the skull shapes in other genus, or sort of other species in the genus.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, is there any understanding as to why our skull shape has succeeded and others perhaps have not over the past few thousand years?
Yeah, so that's a good question, which is what everyone says when you don't know the answer, right? So the question of why any of this happened is we really don't know, is the answer. There are some suggestions about certain aspects of the human facial morphology that may have. Some people have suggested, for instance, that a reduced brow ridge allows for more comprehensive and sophisticated muscles in this region, which allows for more complex eye movements and facial expressions, which was maybe useful in enhanced social connections. So as our societies and social groups got larger, that was something I didn't really get a chance to talk about, but we think that groups sort of got larger and more complex over this period in which I was talking about. As that happened, then maybe our facial expressions needed to become more complex. And so that's maybe one reason behind the reduced brow ridges. As for the globular skull, I'm not really sure, to be honest. I wouldn't count out just the possibility of random chance as well, because this is something that in evolutionary biology we become more conscious of it probably in the last 50 years. So in early Darwinian natural selection ideas, the idea was that everything that happens to a species, every change that a species goes through, is for the sake of enhancing its survival of the fittest, and all of these things. But we've started to realise that not actually every change is for the sake of survival. Some things are purely random. This is something, a concept called genetic drift. So if a population is isolated for some reason in some way for a long period of time, certain traits, even if they were more advantageous to the group's survival, they might have just disappeared for whatever reason. The individuals that had it got killed in a landslide or something, or just didn't happen to breed. And so these other traits happen to continue on. That's genetic drift. So it's possible, it's been suggested that maybe in East Africa, certain traits, and maybe a group was isolated for a certain period of time through drift, or for some reason we developed these globular skulls, and then through maybe environmental changes, they started to move out again and migrate and interbreed with other groups, and that's how the globular skull got passed through. But we don't really know this answer.
Any women want to ask a question? A lady at the back.
Yeah, so...
Hang on.
Oh, so
Yes, recording.
when you had your map and there were these interruptions between when something started and something ended, I found that really fascinating.
Okay.
When I think of emergence of symbolic behavior, I kind of look at it from the perspective of someone who thinks the evolution of language is super important to what makes us human. It kind of facilitates cooperation and all of these other things. So my question is, how far do you have to go back to find some evidence of symbolic behavior that has the emergence and then doesn't have that interruption?
Ooh. Yeah, and it's also a good question. And I also don't know the answer to that one. I don't know that there is a particular time period that we can go back to and say, yes, from this period, humans were using red ochre, for instance, continuously up until the modern day. The thing is that these seem to be cultural traits, which means that they were used by cultures, and of course we know that cultures change and things go out of fashion over time. We know that a lot of what we know about early humans as hunter-gatherers, because that's what all of these early humans were, they were all hunter-gatherers. A lot of what we know about that comes from southern Africa, particularly the Khoisan people of Namibia and the Kalahari Desert region, and a lot of people have studied their cultures for a long period of time and looked at their archaeology as well. And there seems to be a lot of breaks in lots of different types of technologies and behaviours, and their ancestors did certain things thousands of years ago and then stopped doing them and then changed it, etc., etc. So I don't think there is really a time in which we started continuously using certain types of behaviours. If you're asking about language, then that's a very different question as well, and that's very difficult to answer. But yeah, I don't know if anyone has another question.
Can I go back to the globular skull?
Yeah.
One possibility is human birth is a very difficult and dangerous process. Could having a more spherical skull actually make it slightly easier and slightly better survival, and hence be selected?
I think I've heard that being suggested before. It's certainly possible. Yeah. The sort of natural counter-argument to that would be, well then how did Neanderthals and Denisovans survive so well for thousands of years with these elongated skulls? How did all of our early ancestors survive so well with these elongated skulls? I don't know the answer to that, but yeah, that is certainly one possibility. Yeah.
I was just interested, you talked about the one Denisovan fragment.
Yes.
And I just wondered what the actual rough idea of the specimen size for Denisovans, Neanderthals and very early Homo sapiens. I was just interested in how many jigsaws in the puzzle, how many pieces in the jigsaw puzzle have actually got.
Yeah.
Is it really patchy evidence? And is that going to radically change once you can filter out DNA from silt in a cave? And everything is going to, your generation is going to change everything because you suddenly have 100 more pieces in the puzzle than the people before you.
Yeah, so that will absolutely radically change in the next few decades. I'm sure of that. With Neanderthals, we have a lot more pieces of the puzzle, in that we've known about them since the 1850s, as I showed, and we have probably about, I think, 30 or 40 reasonably complete specimens, like full skeletons of Neanderthals, more or less complete, and then we have probably about bits of another 200 individuals as well. So we have a lot of Neanderthal stuff to work with.
What about the Denisovans?
And Denisovans, we have almost nothing.
Right.
Because they were only discovered in 2010 through genetics from that tiny little finger bone.
Okay.
We have a little bit more, again from Denisova Cave in Siberia. There was a few bones. I think it was one sort of fragment of a long bone, so like a bone like this in the arm, that was from, I can't remember exactly how old it was, but they ran it through the DNA machine, whatever that's called, and they found pretty extraordinarily excuse me, that bone was from a Denisovan, a female, possibly a young woman, who, and this was where the bombshell came, and I was hoping to include this, but I wasn't able to. Her father was a Neanderthal, and her mother was a Denisovan. So she is the first and so far only ever first generation hybrid of two different species of human that we've ever found. And she's called Denny. Yeah, she's been referred to as Denny now, and she's very exciting. But so far, that tiny little finger bone, I think a couple of teeth from Denisova Cave again, and Denny are the only pieces of
that's
Denisovans
too much
we've
of a
found.
coincidence to be to think, oh, that was a 1 in a million. If you've only got one sample,
Exactly. Yeah,
you can't think it's a 1 in a million.
It must mean that interbreeding with other species was so much more common than we ever gave it credit for. When we first found out about this in 2010, we thought it was like, oh, maybe it just happened sort of once in a blue moon when they met. But now we found a first generation, and there was also that jaw from Romania of that guy who was, I think, a 6th generation after Neanderthal. His ancestor was a Neanderthal. This must have happened a lot. But yeah, so another thing I wanted to say on this point is that, yes, we don't have the whole skeleton of a Denisovan yet. This is probably because we just haven't been looking in East Asia that much. Again, it's a similar situation to West Africa. And secondly, we didn't know that we were looking for another species. So it's possible that some of the skeletal fragments that we have already from China and Southeast Asia and places like that might actually be Denisovan skeletons. They just haven't been identified as Denisovan yet. So we're going to need to do some DNA on those. If we can't get DNA on them, because unfortunately DNA is very fragile, it doesn't survive very well, then we're going to need to find a Denisovan skeleton and then compare the skeleton to these older fragments that we found. So eventually we'll find some more. Yeah.
Dean.
Yeah, thank you. Slightly off topic. In the film Dune, sorry, I can point now, both of you. The area they find the aliens in, they call it Olduvai, which I've always loved. Sorry, I don't know if you've ever seen Adam Rutherford's wonderful early hours of the morning written talk from the HUK conference last year.
I was there last year, yeah.
Ah, brilliant. But the, excuse my language everyone, the 1 million year clusterfuck that he referred to, where so many different members of our own species and others were intermingling. Yeah. What DNA evidence do we have? And I know it doesn't survive as long as we would love, but what sort of DNA evidence do we have of the sort of genetic drift and the intermingling of different groups of humans within Africa, specifically, from when you were showing those images earlier?
Yeah, so in Africa, unfortunately nothing. The trouble is that, as you said, DNA does not survive very well at all. The oldest DNA we've ever managed to recover from anything was from a horse that we found frozen in permafrost in Siberia, and that was about 700,000 years old. So that was really old. That's way older than we've ever found anything else before. But that was frozen in ice for thousands of years. The oldest DNA we've ever managed to recover from anything or anyone in Africa is 18,000 years old. So DNA in Africa just doesn't survive, partly as a result of just the heat, and also a lot of times the soils just aren't quite right, so I'm told by geologists. So unfortunately we can't really get any DNA about those ancient human species. However, there is another new technique coming out that I didn't get to mention at the end there, something called proteomics, which is something I maybe will be working on with a PhD, depending on how I negotiate with my supervisor. This is a technique which uses proteins to try to reconstruct DNA. So proteins, you might know, are created from our DNA. So when our body wants to create a new protein, it goes through the sequence of DNA, and the DNA tells it to use this building block and this building block and this building block, and it all sort of forms a protein. Proteins survive much better than DNA. They're very hardy molecules. And if we have proteins surviving, then it's possible that we were able to work out the original DNA sequence that it was created from, at least a section of the DNA. And this has been done, I think, just last year in a species called Paranthropus, which is a related species to Australopithecus and early Homo, where they, I think these researchers found some teeth in South Africa from 2 million years ago. Really, really old, just around the time in which early Homo was emerging. Ordinarily, we would not expect to get any DNA from them at all, and we didn't. But they were able to extract some proteins from that, and from those they were able to reconstruct a portion of Paranthropus DNA, which is the oldest DNA we know of in the world. And therefore, they were able to, I think they said that they were able to work out the genetic relationships between these individuals who left these teeth, and the rough relationship to the Homo lineage as well. So that's going to be an exciting field in future.
Thank you.
That's all right.
Yeah, thank you, Oscar. That's a fantastic talk, and particularly the point you just made about new technologies accelerating or expanding our sphere of knowledge is really mind-blowing. So I've got to sneakily have two questions here. Okay. The first one is relating to what you were saying about a sort of single point of evolution within Africa, or a sort of Pan-African model. Is it a meta-evolution? Is that the term?
Metapopulation is the term that's being used in the literature now.
Right. So, I'm just wondering about that in terms of evolution in general, because I always, no doubt these things are out of date, but I remember reading about how speciation tended to happen often through an isolation of a particular population group in general. And so that, in order for these sort of a particular, and then that group would then expand back into the population, or displace it or change it or whatever. And that to some extent plays into what you were saying maybe about the globular skull evolving at one point, and then, so I'm just wondering whether or not that's something, this sort of metapopulation model is something specific to humans, or is that something which you find in other areas of evolution? And my other sneaky question is, I remember reading about there being the idea that there were like two waves of human expansion out of, or Homo sapiens expanding out of Africa, and there was a previous wave, and then there was a second wave maybe, 50, 60,000 years ago, something like that, and then the previous population had disappeared, or did they interbreed with the second wave? So yeah, those are my
your sneaky two questions.
Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, the question about metapopulations, and do we see this in other organisms? I don't know really if we see this in other organisms. I wouldn't be surprised if we did. I think one of the reasons why understanding human evolution has become so difficult in recent years is because we are getting more and more evidence for it. because we're getting more and more evidence, we're starting to realize that evolution is a gradual process that takes place over thousands of years and is very messy and not linear in any way. And that's the case not just with humans, but with probably every species on the planet. The thing is that we've just invested so much more time and resources into studying humans because they're us and we're interested in that we've started to uncover the flaws in the concept of evolution and of the concept of a species itself. So, you know, the idea of a species being like a genus and a species, so we have Homo sapiens, or you know, certain dogs being, you know, like Canis or something like that, having that species name to it. That system, the Linnaean system, was developed by, of course, Carl Linnaeus in the 1700s. That was back when we used to think that the world was a static and unchanging place, and that all organisms on Earth could be classified with this one name, and that was what they were, and that was nice and easy. Of course, that was completely upended with Darwinian evolution, and we started to realize actually the world isn't an unchanging place. But we've kept this Linnaean classification system, and it doesn't really work for evolution over time periods in which we have all of this evidence. We have this high resolution. We don't have enough, as I've demonstrated, but we have a lot more than we do for many other species on Earth. So that's my feeling as to why probably the metapopulation does apply to other species, but we just haven't found it yet. And then your second question, can you remind me again? Sorry.
It's about sort of 2 waves of...
Yes, out of Africa.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so again, we used to think that there was one dispersal out of Africa, and then we were like a tidal wave and just sort of displaced Neanderthals on every front. Now, as you say, we now think there were probably multiple waves of early humans migrating out of Africa, and probably not just 2, there were probably many, we don't know how many, but probably quite a few. The earliest confirmed evidence of Homo sapiens outside Africa was from a jawbone that was found in 2018, very recently, in Israel. It's called the Mislia jawbone, I think, from a mountain, Mount Carmel in western Israel. And that was found to be, I think, between 190 and 170,000 years old. So that's roughly around the time of the Homo kubish and Herto fossils, the grade 3 ones that we had a look at. So humans were moving out of Africa around about as early as that. These early migrations might not have survived. Some of them may have gone out and then they died out, or they interbred with the natives, or some of them may have turned around and gone back into Africa. That's another possibility as well. However, we know that some of them did migrate really far. In fact, we found some teeth in southern China called the Daoshan teeth, which are dated to between 80 and 120,000 years old, and most people think probably the older date of that. So certainly it seems before 100,000 years old, Homo sapiens had gone all the way to East Asia. But again, we don't know how many waves that was or what was going on there. The thing that has sort of thrown a spanner in the works as well is some of you might have heard of a skull that was discovered in Greece a few years ago that was claimed to be the earliest Homo sapiens outside of Africa. This is a fossil called Apodema Cave, and it was a skull that was found sort of wedged into the side wall of a cave in southern Greece in the Peloponnesos, and they managed to extract the fragments of this, and they reconstructed it digitally and saw that it looked very much like Homo sapiens. I think we would place it in grade 2, like Jebel Arud today. But the thing is, it was dated to around about 210,000 years ago. So even earlier than the Mislia jawbone from Israel. A lot of people take issue with that, the Apodema skull. Some people think that the dating was wrong, or some people think that the skull itself looks more Neanderthal, and this is a controversial topic. But it's possible that the Apodema skull was one of those very early migrations out of Africa that maybe didn't make it. It was one of a group that died out there, or maybe they migrated back again.
Got a question from the front.
Just before I hand it over, there's a book called Out of Africa Again and Again.
Yeah.
I read. I don't know if that still applies. It's a book that I enjoyed.
Yeah, I mean, I think mostly does. But then, as you've seen, like, this field moves on so quickly that things become updated very quickly. It's the trouble.
I was wondering from Steve.
Yeah.
What's that?
That was the point.
How's the what?
That was a comment, not a question. So.
Oh, right, sorry. Okay. Well, that was tricky. Sorry. Sorry. Would you like to recommend it?
Don't you agree? Yeah.
Yes, I do. AJ.
Can I ask, please, about? I'm interested that you mentioned the idea about species, and maybe it's my ignorance about evolutionary biology, but my understanding was that species refers to populations or it's the largest group that can mutually sort of interbreed. Yeah. So if we're saying that Denisovans are a different species, or maybe Neanderthals are a different species, but they interbred with Homo sapiens, how can they be? Surely there's sort of like a overall species category that should contain both of them if they're allowed to interbreed. That was sort of the first question. And another one is possibly maybe an insight from neuroscience to answer the globular skull issue. Could it also be, in addition to what Jim said about the birth canal and the skull size, our neocortex and the development of that in sort of in the front of the head, it gives us, or that part of our brain gives us the kind of higher planning abilities, socialization, and sort of predictive ability and controlling our more reptilian older sort of brain impulses in a very simplistic way, and having a more globular brain allows for more room for the neocortex in the front of the brain, I think, and that could have helped possibly survival of species that maybe by accident, as you say, developed that more globular skull, and then that allowed the brain to then grow in these regions possibly.
Okay, so the first question about the definition of a species. Yeah, so that is something called the biological species definition. This is the concept where the way in which you define a species according to biology is that if you have two populations, if they are able to interbreed to produce fertile offspring, then they are the same species. If they are not able to interbreed to produce fertile offspring, then they are different species. So for example, horses and donkeys can interbreed to produce offspring, mules, but they're not fertile, and so horses and donkeys are different species. That's the biological species concept. The trouble with that is that it doesn't really apply, or doesn't really work for a lot of different species, and a lot of people take issue with that concept. For example, species that reproduce asexually, so things that reproduce through like cloning and don't need a mate. How do we define those under the biological species definition? When it comes to Neanderthals, Denisovans, and sapiens, the biological species definition doesn't really work either. Some people have tried to explain this by saying, well, actually, maybe they're all part of the same species. So maybe we should be calling them Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, which is a phraseology that is sometimes used, or Homo sapiens denisova. But equally, that is a very human-centric way of looking at it. We could do it the other way around, and we are actually called Homo neanderthalensis sapiens. Then that's maybe our actual name. Who knows? So yeah, there isn't a good explanation for it. It sort of goes back to what I was saying to Mark about the difficulty in fitting the Linnaean taxonomy system to an ever-changing world.
And what's the anthropological or archaeological counterpart to the biological definition of a species? Is it characteristics and groupings or percentage difference of DNA, maybe? Or?
I don't think anthropology really has like a species definition, really, because the trouble with that is anthropology has such a history of a deeply ingrained racism in the way in which it's historically been conducted, that anthropologists steer very clear away from mentioning the concept of species at all. So I'm not really an anthropologist, so I don't know, but
or archaeology.
In archaeology we don't. No. Your second question. That was about the globularized skull. Yeah, that's also another possibility. So yeah, the prefrontal cortex, for anyone who doesn't know, is the region just at the frontier, which is the region of the brain that seems to be responsible for a lot of the things that we think of that make us human, like future planning and social interconnectedness and things like that. And yes, it's certainly possible that's one reason why the front of our forehead sort of bulged out like that. The trouble is, though, that doesn't really explain the back of our heads, why that became a globe. And secondly, Neanderthals, we have this stereotype of them of being those unintelligent brutes, but we have more and more evidence that they were just as smart as us in many ways, and they did probably many aspects of that behavioural modernity, the symbolic and cultural behaviour that I was talking about earlier. They did certain aspects of that as well. So it's certainly not clear that they were less intelligent than us. And also one thing we learned from things like brain injury studies, so if someone gets brain damage, one thing that we learn from those is that the brain is remarkably plastic and malleable and able to reconnect different areas together, and they're still able to function normally despite having this massive brain injury. And so Neanderthal brains were probably very similar, very plastic and malleable, and they may have just been able to interconnect in different ways. So yes, it's possible again, but
it's a very crude measure, size of brains in phrenology.
It is a very crude measure, which is why I actually didn't really mention it.
Three more questions. This lady. Oh, I'm so sorry. Did you want to ask a question? I'm so sorry. You go.
Oh, hi. I wondered, is there any evidence emerging why such a successful hominid group over so many hundreds of thousands of years died out?
Meaning like Neanderthals?
Yes.
That's a massive question. So we don't know, but we do have a lot of theories about this. We used to think that we simply outcompeted them, that we were better at hunting, we were better at social organisation, we're better at all of those things. But as I mentioned to AJ, we are finding that they were far more capable and intelligent and complex than we ever really gave them credit for. The argument that makes the most sense to me is that there seems to be, a lot of genetic studies have been done on Neanderthals over the last 10 years or so. And a lot of the genetic studies that have been done on the very late Neanderthals, so Neanderthals died out about 40,000 years ago, but they were flourishing for 300,000 years at least throughout Eurasia. But in the last sort of 20 to 30,000 years, they seem to have been struggling, genetically speaking, meaning that we've noticed that in their genes they seem to be, there were a lot more inbreeding within groups. There are a lot more of, we find individuals whose, say, grandparents were cousins, for instance, or their great-great-grandparents were cousins, or something like that. That seems to suggest that Neanderthal groups were becoming much more dispersed across Eurasia. And so there were just fewer options for breeding. And so they had to continually breed within their same groups or within very closely related groups. And over time, this is something called inbreeding depression, which is the concept when there's so much inbreeding, they develop loads of mutations, and it makes them. It's the reason why inbreeding produces sort of deformed offspring and things like that. That's one reason that makes sense to me as to why they declined and disappeared. As to why that happened in the first place, that's another question. It seems to be, the explanation that makes sense to me is that Homo sapiens were just really good at large-scale social organisation. So you may have heard of something called the Dunbar number, and any of those who were at the Humanist UK conference. Anyone, last year, Robin Dunbar gave a lecture about his understanding of the origins of religion, which was super interesting. But yeah, the idea of the Dunbar number is the number of other people in which our brain can realistically form social groups with. And he put that at about 150, which is sort of the average size of hunter-gatherer groups that we see around the world, and he picked out a bunch of other examples of this as well. I asked him about this actually afterwards, after the talk. I said, what do you think the Dunbar number of Neanderthals might be? And he thought, he said, well, maybe around about 100 to 120. I think it's possible it might have been even less than that. And so if there were very small groups of Neanderthals, they maybe were not able to sort of sustain these large-scale social groups over long distances, maybe, but Homo sapiens were able to do that, and we just sort of outcompeted them through just sheer weight of numbers. And over time, there were just too few of them, and there was too much inbreeding depression, and they ended up interbreeding with us, and they were sort of absorbed into us. Maybe that's one possible explanation. But again, it's ongoing. Hopefully that answers your question.
Question over here and then a couple.
So I'm not sure if this makes sense, but are there any research finding like patterns of behavior that could like predict their behaviors in the past, or maybe our evolution in the future?
Patterns of behavior that could predict our evolution in the future? Oof.
I mean, it's very complicated, but I'm not sure that makes sense, because we do rationalize our behavior now from what happened in the evolution. So I wonder if there are like researchers in this area, are people questioning this?
Yeah, so people are talking about this. This, I think, is a concept called evolutionary psychology. So this is when people look at our evolutionary past and try to understand our brains through our evolution, through natural selection. And in some ways, I think this makes a lot of sense. For example, territoriality that we are all too familiar in our modern world, particularly what's going on in certain parts of the Middle East today. That this is our land and is not their land, etc., etc. This the us and them concept, that can be quite easily explained by our evolution, simply due to if you're part of one group, you're more likely to all be related to each other, and so you're going to try to advance the cause of your close family relations, because by advancing that cause, it means that your genes are going to be passed on to future generations. Whereas if you try to counteract and destroy the other group, their genes are not going to be passed on to the future generations, and so your genes are going to be more successful. That concept is it's quite sort of fundamental to evolutionary psychology, and explains certain things like territoriality and racism and things like that. Some people think that evolutionary psychology is quite reductive and a bit deterministic. Leave you to determine what you think about that. But yes, we can use our past to try to work out our future in that sense. But the key thing is that we should really be smarter than that now. We've come a long way from that sort of monkey brain idea, and we should be able to overcome things like territoriality and racism and sexism and things like that. And that's where our prefrontal cortex comes in, and we should be acting on that and not giving into the ancestral monkey brain. But there we go.
We have about 5 minutes left, so if we could make them quite short. Last couple of questions, please.
All right, I've got a hypothetical for you. You're doing your PhD and you're given access to the university time machine. You can make one return trip to the past. How far back do you go?
Oh. Wow, okay. I mean, for the sake of my PhD, going back to 75,000 years ago at Shanidar Cave in Iraq would be pretty helpful. I'll just take a few photos and interview the Neanderthals there. That would help a lot. I guess if we're talking about human evolution and we put aside, like, you know, the Romans and Egyptians and going back to Stonehenge and ask what the hell are you doing and why, if we put all that aside, then yeah, I guess East Africa really, like the Rift Valley, as much as I sort of deride it, that really is the key area of as far as we know, for where we first emerged. I think I would actually go back to about maybe 2 or 2.5 million years ago, because as much as this is a super interesting subject, we actually know a lot more about this than we do about the evolution of our genus now, and I didn't really mention that at all. But between 3 and 2 million years ago, that area is very misty in the sands of time, and we have almost no idea what happened there. But that's a talk for another time, maybe.
You were saying 2001.
Yeah, I have. Yeah. Yes, yeah. It's
Question over here.
pretty good.
Odd one, it's about height. I'm from I became, as a teenager in the late 60s, 1960s, I became the tallest in my family, taller than my parents, grandparents, all my uncles, aunties, taller than my brother and sister. But of course, now the average height is way above that, which is a quick escalation. How tall do you think Lucy was from that link, or other early Homo sapiens, what you may have found?
Yeah, so we have the full skeleton of Lucy, so we know exactly how tall she was. Unfortunately, I can't remember exactly, but she was about 4 foot, is roughly in that area. If you look at it, it's on Wikipedia. But she was a very, very early member of our ancestry, one of the Australopithecus from about 3.2 million years ago. As for early sapiens from about 300,000 years ago, they were probably shorter than the average person today, just as a result of the kind of the lives that many of us in Western countries lead today, in that we have good access to healthcare and food and all of these things. Our ancestors were universally hunter-gatherers, and so that was a much tougher life in many ways. So they probably were shorter. I think a few of them have been estimated around about sort of 5 to 5.5 feet or so around. It's quite tall, but then you then compare them to Neanderthals, who seem to be quite sort of shorter and squatter and sort of stronger. They're very robust and well-built bones. They were slightly shorter than us. That's sometimes suggested as another reason why they went extinct. Maybe they weren't able to run as far and fast as us because they had slightly shorter legs. I don't really agree with that. Yeah, so but our height has increased massively over the centuries. Another species that you might be interested in terms of height is one called Homo floresiensis, Don't know if anyone's ever heard of that at all. Very small, yes. Hobbit Man, I hear from someone there, yeah. So this is a species that was discovered in the mid-20th century on the island of Flores in Indonesia, sort of east of Jakarta and that sort of area. And this is a species of human that seems to have got stranded on this island, and over thousands of years evolved to become much shorter and much smaller, down to about 4 foot maximum, sometimes even maybe 3 foot. And this is a concept known as island dwarfism. It's something we see in lots of other species, organisms around the planet. We saw it like on the Galapagos Islands and places like that. When species get trapped on islands, there isn't as many resources, so they evolve to be smaller. And Homo floresiensis is a tiny little hominin, related to sapiens, maybe descended from Homo erectus as well, and they're referred to as Hobbit Man by some people. So that's one to look up if you're interested in that. It's a cool little thing.
Well, I think these have been some of the most academic questions that we've ever had. This has been incredible amount of knowledge you've shared with us. Thank you so much, Oscar. Just 2 quick fire questions from me before we go. This seemed like an incredibly exciting and glamorous area to be working in, just looking at these pictures here and everything you've shared today.
Absolutely.
Is the day-to-day life of a biological archaeologist as exciting and adventurous as this seems, or what is the day-to-day like?
God, I wish I could say it was. Gosh, it's definitely not. This is one of those things when you talk to people about what you do, and it sounds amazing, traveling around the world and excavating Neanderthals and all that. But yeah, no, a lot of what I'm going to be doing in my PhD is sitting in a lab somewhere in Cambridge with my head in a sort of hood, carefully extracting tiny samples of tooth from Neanderthals in the pitch black darkness, because you have to do it under a certain light, and that's probably going to be my life for the next 3 years. But that's what I subject myself for the sake of advancement of our understanding of humanity. But occasionally, once every year or so, we'll be able to go back to Iraq. That's actually me there last month, only a month ago or so, at Shanidar Cave. The team, led by my supervisor there, tends to go back once every year in May for about a month to try and find out more about this cave and about Neanderthals in this region, because the vast majority of what we know about Neanderthals comes from Western Europe, France and Spain in particular. So this is why this project is so important, because we want to find out about what was going on with Neanderthals in Asia. We know so little about them there.
So you get all your sunlight on these trips.
I get all the sunlight there, and then straight back into the darkness.
And final question, if you could find out the answer to one question during your career, what is the one burning question that you'd love to know the answer to?
Wow.
Archaeological question.
Archaeological question. I guess it's why we won, why we survived
over other species.
Why are we here and the others died out? What was it about us that was so important or special? Are we special? Or was it pure luck that Neanderthals and Denisovans disappeared and we survived? I know there's a lot of questions.
I'm quite confident that you're going to help us make strides towards that. So thank you so much, Oscar, for everything you've done.